let me show you how easy it is to install an HPLC column into an HPLC system. Now in the GC world, this is, it takes a lot of time to learn how to do this. We spend an entire hour during our boot camp class teaching people how to install GC columns, but LC columns are a lot simpler, but they must be done correctly. So let me show you a couple little tricks. First statement, there's lots of different fittings out there, lots of different styles. I'll show you a couple of ones that I like. Stainless steel fittings are fantastic, but they have to be made properly, whereas what I'm going to show you is what are called universal fittings. And also the benefit of the universal fitting is that it's finger tight. So we're going to install this column. This is actually a UPLC column. This is a sub 2 micron, 1.8 micron column. We're going to install it into this HPLC system, this UPLC system. Now, whether it's UPLC or HPLC, it doesn't matter. We install the columns the same way. It's the same technique. So the real trick when we're doing this is to make sure we have extra tubing sticking out beyond the ferrule. Okay, so if you see this fitting, it's a compression fitting, so that ferrule is what's going to make the seal, but the distance of tubing sticking out, it has to be the exact right distance as the column itself. So this is an Agilent column. Agilent columns use swage lock fittings, the most common type of fitting. That is 90 thousandths of an inch. Now we don't try and measure that. Instead of measuring it, what I'm going to do is, so at the end of this, I'm going to only need maybe that much tubing. So I'm going to start with an excess amount. I'm going to put it into my column. The head of the column, we see there's a flow direction. So we're going to place that tubing into the column. So notice what I'm doing. It's bottoming out, and then I'm going to tighten the nut. So I have a little bit of, I always tell people, always make sure you have some downward pressure. So I'm pushing down on that tubing as I'm tightening it. So as long as the tubing is bottomed out, that will be a perfect fitting for this column. How am I sure it's going to be perfect? Well, because the column itself made the fitting. So if I take this off, and carefully, you'll see that is 90 thousandths of an inch. Well, it must be because this is a swage lock piece of tubing or fitting. So let me do that again. Again, I like to have lots of tubing sticking out, bottom out, and then just tighten the fitting. So this fitting, believe it or not, will hold all 9,000 psi that this instrument will generate without a problem. So this is one of my favorite fittings. It's called the double wing nut fitting. It's a great one because it'll hold the high pressures. Now on the other end of the column, just important to make the proper fitting there, and it's the same thing. The distance has to be just right. So I've got another universal fitting here. So it's got plenty of tubing sticking out. I stick the tubing down till it bottoms out, and then while notice I'm pushing in on the red tubing while I'm tightening it. And that way I don't want it to slip out. Even a half a millimeter would give a terrible efficiency for this column. So as long as I'm pushing the tubing in and I get it to tighten, I know that that's a perfect fitting. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put this back into the system. Then we would turn on the pump to see whether or not our column is leaking. So I always tell people, once you've installed the column, turn the pump on, leave the column compartment open so you can see it, and let's make sure we don't have leaks. So the most common place for a leak is going to be at the head of the column. Why is that? Well, that's where all the pressure is. If you think about it, that column, that's the entire pressure drop of the instrument. So if my instrument is running 400 bar, it means it's 400 bar right there. It's probably 1 or 2 bar right there. So this is where we get the leaks. The bottom side, the back end of the column, typically not very common. We could, but not very common. So on the head of the column, usually it's the fitting that leaks. You didn't tighten it enough, the tubing slipped out. So 99% of the time, the leak in the column is really a leaky fitting. And so take the fitting out, put it back in, make sure you do it properly, make sure you bottom out that tubing. We never want to see liquid coming from right here. So notice there's a little gap, and that is the end fitting itself. So the end fitting on the column contains a frit, a filter, and that filter is what's holding in all that expensive packing material. So if you ever see a leak coming from anywhere but the end, so if you see a leak coming from the connection, yeah, that's bad news. That's time to buy a new column. You will generally see, if you get a leak like that, you'll see some a white residue. That's your packing material. So not very common for that to happen. In fact, I'll put it this way. Your column should never leak from the column itself, unless someone has taken it apart. So what do we learn from that little exercise? Don't ever take your column apart. Don't ever open up the column, because once you open it up, nothing good's going to happen. If even a little bit of that silica from inside the column gets into the fitting, silica is harder than stainless steel, and the fitting will never seal again. So don't ever take your column apart, but installing columns in HPLC, really simple. Just make sure that the tubing bottoms out first, and then you tighten the fittings. So that's LC column installation. If you have interest in more videos, let us know what your interest is, and we're happy to comply.